Hello, everyone. This is Eva Klein. I'm an attorney with the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law, and I am working in partnership with the Connecticut Department of Children and Families and the Division of Public Defender Services and the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team there in Connecticut to put on this series of webinars, and this is our final and fourth webinar in this series, and today we're going to focus on juvenile defenders representing victims of sex trafficking. I would like to ask, as people join, and I see there are a few that are continuing to join the Adobe Connect room, and as they come on the line, I'd like to ask you each to put into the chat pod at the bottom of the page what your specific role is, whether you're a juvenile defender, child welfare attorney, a judge, whatever your particular role is as you join this webinar. We like to have people join and put something into the chat just so you know that you can ask questions in the chat and participate in that way. May I ask, can anybody hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, great, because nobody's typing in, so I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't something wrong. There we go. Okay, now we have a couple people joining. Thank you so much. I just want to make sure that people know how to use the chat function because it's an important part of our conversation today to be able to ask questions of our speaker and share information regarding your practice and so forth. So we'll just give folks a couple more minutes to join and type into the chat what your role is, whether it's public defender, as Erica put in, or child welfare attorney, judge, conflict counsel, anything that brings you to this webinar today. And I'm going to, last time we had a little bit of difficulty with people trying to call in through their computers, so I want to make sure that everybody knows to call in on the phone line. Okay. Well, if nobody else wants to share their role in handling cases of sex trafficking of youth, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Sharonda Bradford is with the Public Defender's Office in Los Angeles County, California. She has been a public defender for 19 years, and for the last 3.5 years has been with the specialized trafficking court they have in Los Angeles. And she's going to tell us about her work there and give some information and advice on how to represent victims of sex trafficking. Sharonda, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. As Eva's indicated, I've spent the last 3.5 years working exclusively with victims of sex trafficking in our specialized court here in Los Angeles County. We call the court Star Court, and it is centered here in Compton, California. We accept cases from all over Los Angeles County, and we average over 200 cases at a time here, in LA County. And we accept all kids who are under the juvenile, who are on juvenile probation, regardless of their charge or their history, as long as they do have either some unfortunate Seasick history or if they are at risk of becoming a sex trafficking victim. I'm going to go ahead and get started with our seminar today. Let's talk about what our goals are. Today I'd like to discuss challenging to defending Seasick clients. I want to outline approaches to identify Seasick clients and address their needs. Also discuss how this trauma impacts client interactions with the attorneys, the court, and other service providers. And discuss the best practices that have been developed in Los Angeles County in the juvenile defense of Seasick survivors. So I hope that is what all of you would like to learn, because that's what we're going through today. Before I jump in, I'm going to talk about some of the terminology that we're going to be using. Sometimes we use domestic minor sex trafficking, or DMST, to describe what is happening to these young people. Also, I've also used the phrase Seasick several times already. That stands for the commercial sexual exploitation of children. What we like to avoid in our terminology is using the word prostitution. When you use the word prostitution, it has some very heavy negative connotations, and it also, unfortunately, puts the blame for what's happening to these young people on them by labeling them as a prostitute. We also like to use the word trafficker instead of pimp. I myself slip every now and again with between pimp and trafficker. I do my very best to use trafficker instead of pimp, and that's just because it, again, lets the young people know this is someone who has committed an offense against them, and that we have a proper term for it as trafficker, and letting them know that they are victims of human trafficking. So what is human trafficking? For the purposes of this talk, there are three categories. Those who are under 18, they're involved in commercial sex acts. Anyone under 18 that is being bought and sold for sex is considered a victim of human trafficking, regardless of how they entered into the life. We also include those who are over 18 who are involved in commercial sex acts through force, fraud, or coercion. And then also the third form of human trafficking, which will not be covered today, would be those who are forced to perform labor or services. The one thing that was important to remember is that human trafficking is not limited to foreign-born adults or even to females. Most of the human trafficking victims in the United States are native-born citizens here, and they are our children who are being bought and sold. So at this time, I'd like to hear a little bit from you and have our first survey. And the question is, how much of your practice is dedicated to representing Seasick victims? And I'll wait a second to see what type of experience we have here now. So far, we have 4 people answering that their practice represents 10 to 20%. 10 to 20% of their practice is dedicated to representing Seasick victims. Do we have anyone out there who has at least 50%? Okay, looks like we've got 5 people now at 10 to 20%. So I'm going to assume that most of you here do not have extensive experience in working with Seasick victims, and try to keep the talk scheduled to cater to that audience. First of all, who are these girls? We're going to talk about how to identify Seasick victims. And although my slide says who are these girls, the overwhelming number of identified Seasick victims in the United States are female. I think that is a growing problem here because males are also Seasick victims. I believe we're simply not catching them or identifying them as they come in. As we go through this talk, we'll discuss why it's so difficult to identify the male victims of Seasick and why it's so easy, of course, to catch the young ladies, because that is what we expect to find when we talk about commercial sex. So these are national statistics from a few years ago. The average age of entry to the sex industry is 12 to 14 years old. That entry is made either through a parent or guardian, or if a child runs away and ends up in a situation where they have to sell themselves to survive, and also some girls are kidnapped and forced into the life. We don't have really reliable estimates on how many children are involved, and that's because if most of the industry took place on the street, we'd have better numbers. But girls who are seen walking on the street trying to sell themselves they're usually arrested. And the girls are taught to lie about their age when they're arrested. So most of the victims are invisible because a lot of the Seasick industry is now internet-based, where there are websites, unfortunately, where traffickers go to list young women and men for sale, but again, mostly female. And we have to worry about the fact that the response from law enforcement treats this as like a victimless crime. They go out to arrest the young ladies or the young men who are being exploited, and very seldom do they go after the purchasers or the Johns in this industry. And traffickers themselves are difficult to find just because of, as we'll see later, the way that the victims tend to protect the person that's exploiting them, and also the fact that it is internet-based and it's a lot more difficult to catch a trafficker. And as we talked about before, nationally, 70% of the known Seasick victims are U.S. citizens. My practice here has been in Los Angeles. I'm going to give you some statistics just from Los Angeles County. The median age in Starr Court is between 15 to 16 years old. In Starr Court, 91% of the youth in Starr Court are African American or Latino. I want to say that's just because of where we are located, but when you look at other national statistics, African American and Latino young ladies are more likely to be victims. At the time when I made this slide, we had 210 girls arrested annually in LA County for what would be prostitution-related charges. As of a couple of years ago, California did make a change in the penal code, and the prostitution statutes and loitering for the purposes of prostitution, they no longer apply to juveniles. However, what we've seen now is the young ladies are just simply arrested for something else instead of being rescued. For instance, we have lots of things where police officers come in contact with the young lady who is being exploited. They tend to lie about their name or their ages, and then the police officers simply arrest them for giving false information to a police officer. So regardless of the change in policy, we're still seeing a huge increase in young ladies being arrested who are actually Seasick victims. Right now, I'm going to change that slide there. It says about 40% of the girls are started on probation for non-prostitution charges. Due to the change in the laws, probably now more like 80% of them. And also 80% of the young ladies that we are servicing here at Star Court have had prior or current involvement with the Department of Children and Family Services, which means that 80% of the young ladies at Star Court have either parents who are unable to take care of them or they simply don't have any parents in the picture at all. So let's talk about how traffickers find their victims and recruitment sites. What we found here in Los Angeles County is that a lot of victims are recruited at school, parks, playgrounds, 7-Elevens, foster and group homes. We had a huge scandal here in Los Angeles County where there was a kind of a transitional group home or emergency group home where kids who had run away were being taken to look for permanent housing, and there were actually traffickers just waiting on the street there for one of these young ladies or young men to run out of that facility, and they would just lure them in with, of course, the promises of taking care of them. So the location of that particular group home was so well known with people who meant these children harm that the Department of Children and Family Services was forced to close that group home and to try to disperse its emergency services. The other thing we have to keep in mind is, unfortunately, some of the most damaged people who have been Seasick victims themselves, are now recruiters, and they call themselves the bottom. And that's usually a victim who's been with a trafficker for so long and has been so damaged and brainwashed that the trafficker can now use that person to recruit and also to do his or her dirty work in regards to keeping the victims in line and keeping them working. So although law enforcement sees the bottom as a trafficker, I think once you really get into this type of work, you'll realize that the trafficker is probably the biggest victim of all, because of the fact that he or she has been turned into a predator. So there are a lot of risk factors when it comes to whether or not a child may be susceptible to becoming a Seasick victim. There are the individual characteristics, a person who's been a victim of sexual abuse, abandonment. Abandonment is a real big one. That's why the Department of Children and Family Services, children under those services tend to be the largest number of victims of sex trafficking. We have to look at the environment, pressures from a child's neighborhood or community. Is it a place where there is a lot of poverty or crime? And also at this point, whether or not there is a large gang population. Here in Los Angeles County, what I think has really made the human trafficking blow up here is the fact that local gang members decided that it was easier to sell girls than drugs, because once they got a victim that they could sell over and over again, and if that poor victim is more likely to be arrested than the person that is actually committing the crime, it's a lot easier for gang members to control and make money with Seasick victims right now than it is for drugs, because we've had such a large law enforcement push to get rid of drugs, where it's a lot harder to locate these young ladies and rescue them from gang members. We also have to take a look at the way our society treats sexual exploitation the role of the sex industry in our economy, and also in our culture. Right now in the rap culture, it's a big thing to be called a pimp. It seems to be a positive trait, and unfortunately something that we've noticed here in Los Angeles County is that the traffickers are getting younger and younger, and I think that is due to that rap culture. So we're going to look at our second survey question. Let's see if we can get more people in to answer this one. Second survey is, for those of you who have been working with the Seasick population, is what do you think is most challenging about working with the Seasick population? Is it a lack of resources, lack of awareness from prosecutors, lack of awareness from the bench, or just simply trying to keep your clients safe? And I'll pause to allow for the answers in that poll. Okay, so it looks like of the answers, 100%, everyone who answered indicated keeping your clients safe. And I would agree that that is probably the biggest challenge, because we not only have to keep the clients safe from traffickers, but also from themselves because of some of the decisions that they make that put themselves in danger. So we can't keep them safe until we can identify who they are. So let's talk about how to identify Seasick victims in your caseload. There are a number of things that you can look for that might not be readily apparent to you if you don't have experience in working with Seasick victims. First thing you should look for, of course, is a lack of family support. When you go into juvenile court and you get your file, the first thing you should see is whether or not there is a parent there to talk about why their child might be in juvenile court, or just to show they're there to provide some type of support. Also, if you have a client who has a lot of AWOL, that they leave placement often, and pretty much every placement you put them in. Usually that's because they're attempting to go back to their traffickers. The other thing you need to look out for is if you have someone who has lots of AWOLs, is who that person leaves with. If you have a client who AWOLs usually with other girls or other people who might also be sought by a trafficker, that's a good indication, unfortunately, that they may be recruiting, or sometimes in order to make up for the fact that they have been out of commission because they're in a group home, that you will have a girl ask someone else to leave with them to meet their trafficker so that they can appease him for the fact that she's been gone for so long. You want to look for young ladies or young men who have older boyfriends. If they're there and they're 14, 15 years old and they describe someone as their boyfriend, and you look at them and they seem to be almost 30 years old, usually that's someone who is not only breaking the law in regards to sexual contact with a minor, but may also be exploiting them. You also want to look for children who live with other young females. And they usually say, I live with my cousin or my auntie. And when you meet this cousin or auntie, they seem to also be in their late teens or their 20s. Usually that's because they are both being trafficked, and that person is usually considered the bottom. You also want to check out tattoos. I know that tattoos are a common thing now in society, but when you have the young people, look to see whether or not they have someone's initials or name. If they do, you want to ask them what their tattoos mean. Ask them who paid for the tattoo. And one of the big things that traffickers have done, at least here in Los Angeles County, is that they brand the young ladies with tattoos. So if you keep track of the tattoos that you see, and you notice you have several clients with the same tattoo, chances are you have now just identified a group of people who are being trafficked by one person. You also want to have look out for them when they come back from AWOL. Look at what they look like. Is their hair done? Do they have nails done? Are they just basically dolled up, despite the fact that they've just spent 2 or 3 months on the run from either their home or their placement? Because again, that's usually a sign that someone is also selling them. The tattoos are extremely important. I have been able to identify here in LA County probably good 30 girls just from the tattoo, and they'll always come up with an explanation for it. But probably the most troubling tattoo I've seen is that one young girl returned from an AWOL with the letters ATM tattooed underneath her left eye, and that was her trafficker's way of identifying what she was to him. Now let's talk about how Seasick victims usually present. Most of the time, these young people will refuse help. Regardless of what you're offering, be it another group home, some more counseling, anything, they're usually going to refuse it. As we talked about earlier, they run away quite often because they're trying to get back to the trafficker. They also usually present aggressively. And so if you have a client that just seems to be just angry all of the time, usually, again, it's because you are keeping them away from their trafficker and from where they think they need to be. So if you have a kid that's a little overly aggressive, just doesn't want to listen to you, the judge, or anyone else, chances are they're being exploited someplace else. They also usually display unclear or disjointed memories. They are not able to give you a linear story about where they've been, what's going on in their life. They tend to mix up days and events, and that's the result of their trauma, which we'll talk about later on. And also keep in mind that they will protect the identity of their trafficker. So when you're talking to a young person, you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you ask them not only where they've been, usually you're going to get a pretty vague answer, and that's because they don't want you to get to their trafficker. And the most heartbreaking thing is I want everyone to keep a lookout for is, unfortunately, a trafficker can be a family member. I have had several clients who have been trafficked by had one kid trafficked by her mother, a couple trafficked by uncles, and another trafficked by an aunt. So even though that person may have a legal guardianship or something, sometimes you have to look out for their families as well. I'm going to pause for a second just to see if anyone has any questions or if I should just go on right now. Okay, so we'll move on to why do they choose the life? we have to be really careful with saying that these children are choosing to be trafficked, because we have to be able to legally, we do not allow children to make choices about consenting with sex with older people, voting, entering into a contract, marrying, drinking. Right now in California, they can't even drive. If you're under 18, you can't even drive other people in a car with you with your permit. So we regulate every part of children's lives, and then sometimes we come to a conclusion that these young people are choosing to be in the life. Now, kids who have some trauma background, or they are growing up with in less than perfect circumstances, it's really difficult to say that they are choosing to do something, because as we know, when you're choosing something, that means that you have an alternative, other things that you can decide and things that you can pick from. However, this quote here from a book that I'm going to recommend to you later called Girls Like Us, the author tells you that, abandonment and neglect can create all kinds of attachment disorders that can be used to keep girls from ever leaving their exploiters. So it's not as if they are choosing to do this, it's just their lack of a positive upbringing has made them more susceptible to creating what is called trauma bonds. Even though the traffickers are treating them awful, the young ladies still kind of connect with the trafficker due to what is called the trauma bond. Most of even as I told you earlier, I sometimes forget to flip back from pimp to trafficker, but the traffickers have a method of coercion and control in order to get these victims, to engage in the commercial sex. They isolate them, they use threats, and I think the most effective way that traffickers get a hold of young people is with the occasional indulgences. So it's kind of like the battered woman syndrome, where you end up with a woman who is battered, then you have the honeymoon phase, and then she just goes back to the person that's battering her. That also applies to these young people and who are in trafficking situations. So what helps in forming these trauma bonds are violence, threats of violence, again, the alternating violence with kindness. Isolation is a big one. They make the young people believe that no one else cares about them but their trafficker. And there's also the shame and association, the shame that these victims feel when they've engaged in commercial sex and they're called a prostitute, or they've been raped, or just the fact that they're so young and you're talking about they've lost their virginity and are sexually active. That shame keeps these victims tied to their trafficker, because again, if the trafficker makes them believe, I'm the only one that's going to accept you as you are. And they also have this belief that if they're disloyal in some way, that their exploiter will know and also retaliate against them. In your practice, and you want to look for some indications of trauma bonds, and this does require you to have a good rapport with your client, so you can get him or her to share this with you, or at least to allow you to see this manifest. They're usually hypervigilant to their exploiter's needs. That's why they AWOL so much, because there are ideas that, look, my trafficker needs this money. I'm the only one that can provide for him, and so I've got to get out there regardless of what the risk is to me. They do everything they can to keep the trafficker happy in order to decrease violence. And they usually see the world from the trafficker's perspective. And they see the outside authorities, their lawyer, judges, DAs, police officers, as the bad guy. And sometimes he or she's just grateful that they're not being killed at that moment. Just the fact that the exploiter is being nice and not beating it at that moment, for some reason allows them to bond even more with their trafficker. Now, the next slide that I'm going to show you gives you an indication as to why human trafficking has become such a big deal, as I told you before, especially with the idea that gangs in California are now using Seasick victims to earn money. And here it tells you about the supply and demand. This is why these exploiters work so hard to get these young people. A lot of my clients, and again I have girls here, they report having quotas of 10 to 30 customers per night. And they're required to bring in $500 to $1,500 a night. And all of that money goes to their pimp or the trafficker. It's a very low risk for the trafficker, again, because they're so difficult to trace. And again, they have the protection of gangs in some communities. And if you were to just, do simple math, that if a trafficker has 4 girls, he tells all the girls they have to make $1,000 a night. Well, you do the math here. We're at, over $1 million a year when you have 4 girls making that type of money. That is why we've had traffickers who are so intent on getting young ladies out of safe situations where they have either gone to group homes and attempted to take the girls away, and also I've had instances where a trafficker has actually returned to a client's home and threatened her parents in order to get her out of the house and back with him. And the last poll question, those of you who answered talk about how, says that the most challenging part of working with the Seasick population was was keeping them safe. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about now. This happened here in Southern California. There was a police report, and it's dated, again, it's a while ago, July 19, 2013. So the officer's investigation revealed that the defendant, which was a 15-year-old, they picked her up for was here 647B, which is our code for prostitution. And they said they contacted her mother, and the mother told them that she was far away, but she would make arrangements for the defendant's cousin to pick her up from the station. So they processed the young lady out and they released her to her cousin, who was identified as Curtis Kennedy. And later on, we discover here that Curtis Maurice Kennedy was actually a pimp called Cash. He was someone who was also branding girls with the name Cash, and just because our law enforcement agencies here tend to work together, we were able to catch the fact that we had a police station actually release a young woman back to her trafficker. One of the ways that you can keep your clients safe is by really trying to connect with your client. And I have a list here on the PowerPoint, but I want to point out some things that I think are most important. The one thing you must do as an attorney or anyone else working with a Seasick victim is be consistent. Don't make promises that you can't keep. And it's the simple things. If you tell a young lady that you are going to go see her in placement on Monday, make sure you make it there and don't, casually decide, I'll go at another time. You have to make sure you never hide any information from them because they already don't trust you. And if it looks like, you're hiding things from them, there's even more reason for them not to. And the one thing you really should do, and this is pretty basic, don't ever touch them without permission. Even if it's just a pat on the back, if it's to guide them to a chair or anything, just please, don't do that. And be non-judgmental. And I know this part is hard because if you do make a connection with the client and they start to tell you some of the awful things that are happening to them, if you react in a way to let them know that you are shocked, that sometimes brings on the shame and they just won't share anything else with you. And say before, consistency is the big key. When I started working with this population, probably within about a month of my assignment, I met a young lady and I tried to talk to her about why she kept leaving placement. And she told me she had a problem with the people in placement and she wanted to be moved. So why didn't you call your social worker? And her answer was, well, I did call my social worker. I called her several times. And then I called my pimp because he always picks up on the first ring. So we have to make sure as the people who are tasked with helping the victims, the Seasick victims, that we stay consistent and available for them. And again, I know that's really hard given our time constraints and the fact that we have lots of clients, but if you have someone on your caseload who is a Seasick victim, try very hard to always be available when they call, because if they are reaching out, it's because they really do need help. Now, one of the biggest concerns we had in LA County before the formation of our specialized court was really educating prosecutors on what was happening to these Seasick victims, even though they were being arrested for other crimes. When you're preparing to talk to a prosecutor about getting a good disposition for your client, be prepared to educate the prosecutor on Seasick attributes, on what it is like to be, what trauma bonding is, and why this person may be in the position that they're in. What you want to do is show that your client is a victim and not the victimizer. Like I said, despite the fact that we no longer arrest young people for prostitution here in California, what we found is these young people are being arrested for a multitude of things, and prosecutors sometimes would see that as, as if they are really for lack of a better word, just a menace and that they can't be controlled. But you really want to show them what is going on in the child's life and why they may be acting out in that way. Always get records from child protective agencies. As I told you before, here in California, we found that 80% of our Seasick victims have some record with the Department of Children and Family Services. I use those records to show prosecutors that this child is not choosing this life, that somehow it was put upon him or her, that even at the age of 2, 3, or 4, that they were not afforded the protection of a loving family. And this is why this child may deserve a lesser punishment for whatever they're being prosecuted for. I've also found quite helpful using psych evaluations, because if I can get some type of diagnosis other than, okay, he or she is being trafficked, that I can pull a DA over to see that there is some treatment available and that there's some light at the end of the tunnel, and again to show that these children are not choosing to be in this predicament. It's helpful to always have a treatment plan. And if you're a defense attorney, like most of you here are, defense attorneys, I think it's helpful when you walk over to a prosecutor and say, this child has this problem, and this is what I think is the best way to address it. And of course, we all know that locking them up just simply doesn't work. So you want to have a treatment plan available for the prosecutor.
Also, before you, sorry, could I interrupt you? This is Eva. Sorry, I just wanted to ask about those psych evals and that sort of trauma history and information and sharing that information. I know that in some circumstances we've received pushback from public defenders, defense attorneys generally, that they're hesitant to share that kind of information because it can re-traumatize the child, or it may provide information that they don't want the prosecution or the court to have because they might then be treated differently by the court. Do you have any thoughts on that? It sounds like for you it has worked, and was that specifically in the Star Court that works, or do you find that works generally regardless of which court, or even before you practiced in the Star Court?
I can say that it works, of course, specifically in Star Court. When you're outside of a specialized court, you do have to be careful about what it is that you, what information that you give. But I found that if you are really precise with the expert that you appoint and tell them exactly what you want to address, that you're going to get a report that is kind of tailored to what it is that you want to do. Of course, you have to be able to read your DA and your judge to see if is there someone who's going to react negatively. But I found that if you are intentional in how you and who you appoint to do the report, and tell them exactly what questions you want answered, that you're going to get a report that I think you can use.
Great. Thank you so much. And if I may just take one other minute and let people know, participants know that in the resource pod, which is at the bottom right hand of the view, there is a resource there that's from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and was compiled as a trauma resource for juvenile defenders along with the National Juvenile Defender Center. So I encourage folks to download that and take a look as well, because it addresses some of these issues that Sharonda is addressing as well. And sorry for the interruption. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. I actually need to take a breath. Okay, so, and the next thing you usually have to worry about is preparing the court and the judge. Always, again, be prepared to educate the court on these issues. Use your experts when necessary. And if you have parents available who can really tell the court how hard it has been for them to either protect their child or the efforts that they've put in place to protect their child and the support that they need. I think that it goes a lot further with the court when they know they have supported parents. That is rare, but when you do have them, please use them. And consider written motions, so that way when you are giving this information to the court in regards to your child, that you give the court the opportunity to kind of read and digest the information prior to coming to court. I can only say here in Los Angeles County, criminal defense attorneys, we tend to shy away from, long written motions, but I found that it helps a lot in cases where you have a judge who is completely uneducated in this area. And I know the last one I put in there, and I said, let the court know when the client is having a bad day. The reason I put that there is because, as we know, these Seasick victims present with hostility. And some people who are on the bench take that personally, and they think that the child is not, being differential or that being disrespectful to the court. The problem is this, that most of these kids have been traumatized in such a way that there's nothing that the judge or a prosecutor can do to them that is scary, because they have already been traumatized in such a way that, of course, they're not afraid of the court and the prosecutor, because what are you going to do to me that hasn't already been done? So if you can approach the court and let them know, this child might be coming a little hostile. Maybe if we can de-escalate the situation. If, I've had kids come in and, curse at the court and all that, but if I found that if the judge doesn't react or just gives them a, sorry you're feeling that way, that it helps to let the court know this may happen. Please do not use this against my client. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Star Court and what we've done here in Los Angeles County. As I've told you, Star Court is a dedicated court. It's designed to work with children who have identified as Seasick. The bench officer, prosecutor, public defender, any of our contracted bar panel attorneys, and the probation officers are all trained in handling of the Seasick population. We use the court. It is voluntary. Young people are never forced to come into Star Court. We have frequent court dates, usually monthly, so that way the kids know that we are connected with them and we want to know what's going on with them. We try to keep kids at home, but, placement is always a possibility, especially if we think home is unsafe. They have our trafficking unit probation officers are extremely active. I actually think they are the backbone as to why Star Court works. There's frequent checkups with the girls, but their emphasis is just on education and counseling. We don't have probation officers in Star Court who go in with the idea that they're going to lock a child up or punish them. The probation officers in Star Court are specially trained to be therapeutic in their approach to the young ladies who are in Star Court. We also ask, the young ladies if they're really ready to leave what, we call the life, but that's not really a requirement, because we understand sometimes they say yes, they're really not ready. We use a collaborative approach. Prosecutor, probation, defense attorney, we all work together to develop a plan of success for the court participant. We have a very special meeting every week. We call it the multidisciplinary team meeting, where every case is on calendar for the following week. We sit down, discuss what's going on in that young lady's life, develop a plan, come to a consensus as to what should happen on their next court date. And in this in this meeting, we have someone from the Department of Children and Family Services, an educational law consultant, someone from the Department of Mental Health, public health nurse. We have mentor advocates. Right now we're using the organization Saving Innocence. We hold empowerment events for the young ladies at least once a month for us to all get together and do something fun so they can see us outside of court. And also we have developed what's called the Victim Witness Protocol, where we give young ladies support when and if they go to testify against their trafficker. Okay, right now, what I have here is just entitled Healing youth words. They're just things that young people have told us after they've gotten involved in Star Court. And this young lady talked about how, says she, a cop, treated me like I was a real person. She even used to call me on weekends just to check on me and make sure I was doing good. It's amazing how much being consistent with them and being intentional with your contact can be life-altering for these young ladies. And I know I'm coming up on 10:55, so I'm going to stop for questions. Any questions? Comments? Okay, someone's typing. Okay. And also, if we could take a moment to do our last poll, when I asked, given unlimited resources, what would you create to make a better legal system for the Seasick population? And the choices were nationwide training for lawyers and judges, specialized treatment facilities, would you lobby lawmakers for favorable statutes, or would you develop a prevention and awareness program for parents and caregivers? And it looks like from that poll, almost all of you are going with specialized treatment facilities. So I guess the next question is whether you would think those facilities should be locked or unlocked. I find that to be the dividing point usually between prosecutors and defense attorneys.
Sharonda, this is Eva again. I'm just going to jump in real quick and just mention that for those of you who have clients who are also in the child welfare system, placements, residential placements, continue to be allowable and reimbursable for funding for placements that are specialized for trafficking victims. And so, that's something to consider and work with your agency on looking at that as a potential placement for your clients, but also recognizing that those specialized treatment facilities are in such great need.
And also, I'd like to say, I'm sorry, let me read Ms. Wardle's question. What can defenders do to support disclose currently? Okay, so Ms. Wardle's question is, what can defenders do to support clients who are suspected of being trafficked but aren't willing to disclose that info currently? How do we balance our defense obligations with the system's desire to help our clients? That is probably the most jarring thing about working with the Seasick population is you have to keep track of not just their legal defenses, but also trying to get them help. But practically, if you just want to support the clients who you suspect of being trafficked, I think you should need to keep a very close eye on that child and talk to them as often as you can to see if you can get them to disclose. Because, of course, you can't reveal that they're trafficked if they don't want you to get these services. So when you're talking to them, unfortunately, if they don't want to disclose, is that you're going to have to become their support system as a defense attorney. You're going to have to be the one to say, hey, if something goes on in the middle of the night and you just need someone to talk to, you need to call me. Or do everything you can to encourage them and tell them what services are available if they were to disclose. And then also let them know that what you would not disclose anything if they don't want to have disclosed. It is a very difficult position to be in when you know that there's a child who needs this help, but they don't want to give you that information. What I have seen, what I've done here in LA County when I have a child in that situation is I ask them if they'd be willing to at least meet with our mentors from Saving Innocence, because they're all people who are closer in age to the young ladies. They're all specially trained in giving them this type of emotional support. So I tell them, even if you don't want to go fully into Star Court and getting a specialized probation officer, can I at least make one connection to try to support you in, what I think is happening to you. Is that a sufficient answer for you, Ms. Warder, or is there something else? Oh, she's typing.
And Sharonda, I'm very sorry. I'm just going to, I'm going to leave the chat box up. I know you had some more information you wanted to share, and I want to let people know that your PowerPoint is in the Juvenile Defender Resources Pod. And, people can feel free to stay on and ask questions in the chat, or Sharonda, if you're continuing to be available on the phone as well. But I did want to let people go. Be respectful of their time at 2 o'clock, and also ask you to please, on your way out, to answer the questions that we have here at the end. And I thank you so much for joining. And Sharonda, thank you so much for presenting. It's an excellent presentation. And I encourage folks to stay on and continue to talk or, chat, enter questions in the chat as your time allows. Thank you.
And I think my email address is on the front of the first slide, so please feel free to email me.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, thank you so much. If nobody else has any questions, then we'll go ahead and close it down. But we really appreciate your participation.